Hello, good morning. My name is Benjamin Musekiwa, and I'm from the University of Zimbabwe, and I'm going to be talking to you today about histories of infections, particularly how resource constraints and claims to land facilitate livestock disease exposure in the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area. This is part of my MPhil study by the University of Zimbabwe under the 𝐆𝐚𝐫𝐽 project funded by IRD, France, in collaboration with 𝐶IRAD Zimbabwe. Just to give a background of the study, transfrontier conservation areas are part of a landscape with high livestock wildlife densities, and there are multiple land use areas. And this has tended to attract a lot of threats to local livelihoods. And in this case, I'm looking at disease threats that are affecting mostly cattle production. Drivers of these threats to local livelihoods have evolved over time, and they have modified the local people's interactions with the landscape in which they live, and those are some of the scholars to support it. The study took place in the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area, where researchers and policymakers are putting an emphasis in trying to limit disease contraction in some of those areas. And in this study, we tried to interrogate how land claims and resource constraints facilitate exposure to disease. Okay. And in terms of the purpose of the study, the first purpose is to demonstrate wildlife livestock disease landscape that local communities encounter in the Sangwe communal area. And the second one is to examine the determinants of exposure to livestock and wildlife disease in that area. And the methodology that we used in this study was predominantly qualitative. Data was collected through ethnographic fieldwork. Qualitative methods such as in-depth interviews, participant observations, and participatory mapping were employed. And 89 interviews were conducted, 3 workshops to try and validate some of the information that we're getting, and also 3 participatory mapping exercises. And on the right there, at the top corner, it's an example of the participatory maps that were developed by the communities with very minimal interruption from the researchers, and below they are the farmers that are developing the participatory map. So stratified sampling was used at deep tank level based on gradient distance from the protected area, so that we can see whether or not there are differences in terms of exposure to disease, and also try to establish a link between the pox and emergence of disease, and also the disease risks. The veterinary department assisted in the selection of respondents, and also translation of local language, because in the area the people speak mostly in Shangani, in Ndebele. It has multiple ethnic groups, and the veterinary department was very instrumental in translations. Thematic data analysis was done using Excel to try and establish the patterns that were emerging in relative to the objectives of our study. And that is the study area. On the top, the green part are the protected areas, and the brown part are the ones that we selected. So we were working on Ward 13, 15, and 14. Ward 13 and 15 are more closer to Gonarezhou National Park, and Ward 14 is more close to Kruger National Park. And this area has a history of disease emergence and disease issues, and we're trying to now understand what is it that is driving disease exposure from a socio-ecological point of view. So just to describe maybe the context of the area, just like Lucy, it's Lucy, the first presenter, just like what she mentioned, this area was not laying idle before the creation of the parks. There were people that were living in the area, but I'll start off with Ward 14, which is a more simpler and straightforward history. In Ward 14, the areas that I selected, Percy, Puzani, and Davata, the people that were interviewed in those areas have always been staying there. They were not evicted from the Kruger National Park. In as much as there were people who were evicted from Kruger National Park, they were evicted onto South Africa and not to the other side of Limpopo River, and that's Limpopo River that is dividing Zimbabwe and South Africa there. So there is no history of eviction. People were always staying there, and they were grazing their cattle in Limpopo Valley, which is resource rich in terms of water and pastures as well. And then in Ward 13 and 15, that is where we have people with different historical backgrounds, but the area is dominated by the Shangani. They are the indigenous group of the area. Some of them were living in 𝐾𝐬 National Park at the confluence of Runde and Sabe River, and some of them were living a bit closer to Tongwanezi River. And when the park was gazetted in 1968, they were moved, and most of them were settled in the area that I've encircled in blue, which is adjacent to the protected area. Most of them are actually in the 5-kilometer radius from the park boundary. But when they were settled in there were other people who were already staying there, the Shangani and also the Ndebele, who came into the area in 1954, having been evicted from Filabusi. So in this area, we have in Ward 13 and Ward 15, with people who have a history of being evicted from the park, and other people who had been accessing resources in the park before it was created. And when it was created in 1968, restrictions then started coming in terms of access to grazing. And it is important to understand that livestock herding is livestock production is actually one of the dominant livelihood strategies in that area. And because of that, there's a high dependence on natural resources for economic gain. So when the park was created, in 1985, there was then the fence that was erected by the veterinary department in terms of controlling foot and mouth disease transmission. And when that fence was erected, it then caused somewhat limited access to resources that they used to access historically. So that area that I've highlighted in green, that is encircled in green, it's an area that is also resource rich, but it is only benefiting those communities that are a bit farther from the park. So in essence, the geography is characterized by such a situation where people who are closer to the park are more resource constrained, and those that are a bit further to the park are more privileged because they have access to that area, which has a lot of pastures and a lot of water for their cattle. So that is just a description of the study area that I have just been demonstrating. So I'll move to the findings. In terms of the findings, farmers were asked to do a free listing of the diseases that they're experiencing. And those are some of the diseases that are experiencing, but we then zeroed in to try and understand which diseases are the ones that are coming mostly from wildlife. And foot and mouth disease is the most cited disease, and it's affecting almost all the areas, even those privileged ones that I've just mentioned, which are closer to areas which are far from the park and don't really need to get to the park for grazing. But you'll see that the numbers are very high because foot and mouth disease has very high morbidity. It can spread very quickly, and there's been very poor response from the veterinary department in terms of controlling it before it spread to other areas. And then general disease, I've emboldened it a bit because it's the one that has also been confirmed to be coming from wildlife. But for this objective, it was very clear that since the 1980s, there have been more convergence than divergence in terms of disease knowledge, where the veterinary department is explaining to people the connection between wildlife and livestock disease, and because they've also been putting up the game cordon fence to try and justify why they shouldn't take their cattle to the park. But the main question that we had now, which is more like the curious matter for our paper, is that why, knowing that in the park there is disease, do people keep sending their cattle there? And also the Limpopo Valley that I've demonstrated previously, it is also very much diseased, because in as much as it is resource rich, people say the Limpopo Valley is actually more resourced, more than the Kruger National Park. So buffaloes are crossing from Kruger National Park into the valley because it has better pastures compared to the part of Kruger National Park which is closer to their households. And one respondent even said there's buffalo grass which is preferred by buffaloes. So there's very high buffalo population, and most FMD outbreaks, they come from that area. So the question now was why, knowing that there are diseases in those areas, the areas are dangerous, do you keep sending your cattle to those areas? And one of the things that came up is you could almost sense the fact that when you ask them, they would say, why not? Because there is a history, particularly for those areas that are indicated in Ward 15, which is closer to 𝐾𝐬 National Park, and they're the ones that have more citations in terms of reasons for taking cattle there. Patlela, Masukwe, it's there in Ward 13, Malepati and Mhlekwane. They are areas that are characterized by people who we used to have access to the protected area, particularly 𝐵𝐵𝐺𝐻 National Park, and were then prohibited because of the creation of the national park. But they keep sending their cattle there because they say it is our right. That is where we used to say. So in terms of the categorization, there's land claims. For land claims, there are those people who were saying it is rightfully our area where we should take our cattle, and why should we not take our cattle there? So then in terms of historical access, it is for those who were not evicted, but they used to have access, and they're saying that is where we've always been grazing our cattle, so we take our cattle there. And then in terms of eviction, I was just trying to indicate that it's not uniform in terms of the claims. There are various factors that are contributing to these claims, and then there are competing interests. When the game cordon fence was erected, the veterinary department was trying to justify that we're trying to protect your cattle from disease, but then in counter, the local communities are saying, yes, you're protecting our cattle from disease, but what about hunger? Because there won't be any food for our cattle, because this history has sort of informed land scarcity for these people. And because of that, now they're saying, what about hunger? And one respondent even indicated that we can cure disease, but we can't cure hunger. So we are sending them in the park despite the knowledge that they will get diseases, but we'll deal with the disease after. So those are some of the issues that are coming from competing interests, and also changing rules in terms of access. People are now being told that you can't access these areas. They're trying to contest. So in terms of history, what we our understanding here is that grazing is almost used as a tool to reclaim some of the places that people were removed from. So in essence, we're almost saying it's grazing with a political element in some sense. And then there are other factors. So you realize that the determinants are split into the history and also resource constraints. For resource constraints, you realize that there's that yellow one that is almost prominent in all the areas, even in those areas that are not closer to the park. In the area, there are customary rules that almost inform farming practices, and those customary rules are followed by almost everyone because they come from the chief, and there are penalties if you don't follow them. And what they say is, in the rainy season, this one is seasonal because it only applies to the rainy season, when people are told you have to keep your cattle away from the fields. And in some of the areas, the fields and the grazing areas are almost in the same area because these communities are not really organized in the sense that pastures at this side and fields at this side. So the park now and the valley are almost used like giant paddocks to send their cattle there, unherded, and then they come to the fields to provide labor. So the protection of crops and the manpower are directly linked, because what the chiefs were saying when they created these laws was, we need to be manning our fields and providing labor throughout the cropping season. And if we are manning the fields and also the cattle, it'll be difficult. But if you have an option not to herd your cattle throughout the day, you can send them where you know they won't be coming back to the fields. And the park is one place that is seen as a giant paddock, particularly for those ones that are closer to the protected area, even though they are dangerous. And for the valley, it's also seen as a vast area where when they send their cattle, because there are good pastures there, they won't come to the protected to the fields, even though they know that the valley is pretty much dangerous. So that's one of the key drivers. And also limited pastures. There's a sense that in the communal area there are limited pastures because the factors are quite numerous. And at this point, we are still analyzing our data. It's still at the preliminary stage, and we've just been looking for the patterns. But in these patterns, there are other micro elements that are informing the limited nature of pastures, inclusive of demographic changes in these areas, and some of the things that are leading to the limited pastures issues is the fact that people are now having this high livestock density. There's been an increase in people owning goats, donkeys, and they've been an overgrazing in the communal area, so much so that cattle, because they are large herbivores, they would need more pastures, and they tend to go to those areas that have more pastures. So that is why we have a livestock preference there, because it is very hard to keep cattle grazing in an area that is bare. So they tend to move to areas that they know we can find pastures there, and it's almost we could almost get a sense that there's somewhat a history for cattle. They tend to decide areas where they go, but we'll still try to analyze this data to really see what are those micro elements that are leading to such access to these areas. And there's also access to water is another point where cattle tend to then go, and this is mostly linked with the dry season where most water sources will be drying out, and cattle then go to the areas that have more major water sources like Mwenezi River and Limpopo River, which are adjacent to protected areas. And in terms of the discussion, we established in this study that disease is indeed an issue, and it is linked to interface with wildlife. And this is also in a confirmation to literature that we have seen both in the area and beyond. But what then comes through this study is a potential addition to literature and scholarship is that disease exposure is linked to land claims, more so for communities on the fringes of 𝐵𝐺𝐻𝐿 National Park, because they have land claims and they have the feeling that we have the right to get in there to graze our cattle. In other areas where claims are silent, local farming practices drive disease exposure, as I've indicated in that other slide that was speaking more to other resource constraints that drive encroachment into the park. Suggestions for management here is until natural resource scarcity is addressed, communities adjacent to protected areas will continue to be strained to drive their cattle into diseased and dangerous areas like the PAs, because they are strained by resources. It's almost like they're saying we don't have an option, we still have to go there. And because they feel that land scarcity or resource constraints that they are facing are linked to history then comes in as one of the determinants that we might want to be looked into. Not that we can get back to the past, but there are now then suggestions that dealing with these infections may require multi-stakeholder land use planning and management, particularly in relation to livestock grazing lands. And possible solutions for this could include maybe defining pasture zones to optimize growth, quality, and sustainability, and also maybe allocating more grazing space for communities in the PAs, but under a regulated regime. Because in interviews with the communities, you could almost get the sense that they're saying other areas have buffers, like maybe when we look at Hwange is a buffer between the Sekumi forest and the communal areas where cattle can graze, which then limits somehow incursion into the protected areas. But in 𝐵𝐺𝐻𝐿, it's a hard edge. In some of the communities, you can the park boundary, the veterinary fence, is almost a meter away from the farm fields. So it's so much of a hard edge that people are saying we need more space to graze our cattle. We have no problem with the fence, we have no problem with the disease control measures, but what we don't have right now is space to graze our cattle. And we have also practices in here that we have to keep our cattle away from the fields. So where should we take our cattle? So they want more space or maybe grazing under a regulated regime to say you can bring your cattle during these times of the year. So there's need to try and allocate more grazing to communities, and how to do so becomes the $1 million question. Thank you so much.